Hey guys, Julie here from Paint Party with Julie. I'm so excited to paint with you today, so tag along as I teach you summer camping. Hey guys, Julie here. I am going to be showing you how I paint this beautiful camping sunset. The brushes that I'm going to use, I'm actually going to recommend using a filbert, which is kind of like a rounded brush. If you don't have filberts, any large round brush will do, but this is really good for getting the texture in the sky. So that's what I'm going to recommend, a filbert. That's what I'm using. The rest of this painting, I'm just going to either use a little detail brush, a small square brush for the trees, and then I might jump and use a large square brush just for the bigger areas. But really, as far as technique goes, the only brush I would recommend would be a filbert or any large rounded brush. And you'll see why I recommend that here pretty quick. The colors I'm going to be using are a primary yellow, a bright blue, a matte black, and I'll explain why I recommend using a matte paint, white, red, and like a teal. But you can use any colors you want. This is just what I thought would be kind of fun for this time of year. So I'm going to start off with my brush and get some yellow paint on there. You'll notice I traced half of this in Sharpie and half of it I just left the carbon outline on there. The reason why I did the black outline for the trees around the moon and around the camper is because I wanted those to stand out. I would not recommend tracing this in Sharpie because we want these just to be a gradual progression of color. And so actually I'm going to want to kind of make sure that that line ends up being covered up. So I'm taking my brush with a thin layer of yellow paint and I'm smushing it. I jokingly call this the smushy technique. And all I'm doing is smushing the brush into the canvas. We want lots of texture, but we also want thin layers because this is going to need to dry between steps. And so just make sure to let your painters know to do a thin layer because it will need to dry. And I'm going to kind of paint over that little line, but I just want this to be our glow as the sun is setting. Then I'm going to take a little bit of that same yellow. I'm going to paint the moon. It doesn't matter that I'm painting over the line because this is all going to be black paint. So I'm just going to put some yellow paint on there. I'm not too concerned with painting outside the line. I'm going to use a smaller brush now and paint the yellow inside the camper window. And if you get a little bit on the outline, don't worry about it because we're going to outline this at the very end. And a little bit in the camper window. So the little yellow in the door window, little yellow in the camper window, little yellow for our setting sun glow, and then our moon. I'm going to use some red paint and just paint the center of this fire flame. Just kind of like a U shape in the middle with red. Now I'm strategically going to kind of jump around the canvas and paint different areas because I want certain areas to be drying while I'm working on other areas. So I'm actually going to come down here and start painting my camper while the sunset starts to dry. So I'm going to paint my little camper gray and teal, but once again, you can customize this however you like or however your painters like. So I'm going to come in here and paint the bottom portion of my camper, this fun kind of retro teal. And I'm not too worried about painting over those lines. Just want to get a nice, even color on there. Now, I do want to recommend, if you're going to teach this, you may want to actually teach it flat, how I'm painting it, versus having it set up on an easel. The reason being is when they start doing this smushy technique that I jokingly call it, the canvas is going to be moving if you have it set up, because as they're smushing their brush against the canvas, it will kind of migrate to the other side of the table. So depending on if there's another person sitting over there, it could be a very awkward situation. So if you want and you have the space to allow it, and if you're teaching this as an in-person paint party, you might want to consider leaving the easels and just teaching this one flat on the table. So just doing a layer of this pretty teal color. But if you want a pink camper, a purple camper, black and white camper, whatever you want. Now my painting has gray in it, so I'm just going to mix a little bit of black and white on my plate. But if you're painting this and you have gray paint, or if you want to supply your painters with gray paint, you are more than welcome to. But I'm just going to mix a little bit of black and white to make a light gray. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to paint the hitch gray. And remember, this doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to come in and do a final outline in black. And that's when all the little mix up, or the little discrepancies, all the lines will be cleaned up. So I'm going to paint my tire gray. Now, most of the time, a tire is black, but our background is going to be black, all of the trees. So I needed to make that little tire stand out. So once again, I'm just going to do it in a gray. I'm also going to paint our fire pit rocks. And then I'm also going to paint the top of the camper and the door a light gray. Traditionally, these kind of vintage campers, the top is like a white color. But because this is supposed to be at sunset, kind of at night, I'm going to do just a thin coat of a really light gray. So it almost looks like it's at nighttime or in the shadows. Nice even layer. And what I've learned over doing so many paint parties is that sometimes the sequence in which you teach them is just as important as any technique. Because, you know, we're using acrylics, which dry very quickly. But sometimes you need to blend colors. Sometimes you need to let one area dry before you paint next to it. So as you're looking at paintings that you want to teach, also be mindful of the sequence in which you will teach them. So that way people's paintings can dry if they need to. Like how I mentioned, we started off with this area right here, and now I'm just letting that area sit by itself. Now, you're more than welcome to leave the hole that is the door open if you want that to just be one glowing entryway. I thought the closed door was cute. And once again, I'm not too worried about painting over those lines because I'll come back at the very end and re-outline the camper. But just remember where those lines are. And you can definitely get super creative with your camper as far as like lights or a little banner or any fun little extra details. But I wanted to keep this a little on the simple side just because we have so many other details in our painting. We have the sunset. We're going to have the smoke from the fire pit. So once again, they can definitely make this a lot more you know, give it some pizzazz if they want to, but I didn't want to overwhelm this painting with a ton of details. So I just wanted to kind of keep the camper a little simple. And plus, isn't that the point of camping, is to keeping it simple? Okay, so my kind of sunset glow, this yellow, is starting to dry, and it doesn't have to be completely dry. And I'll always tell my painters, I go, if your paint is shiny, it means it's wet. If it's kind of half shiny, half dull or matte, that means that it's starting to dry. So this is probably about 50% half wet, half dry. And like I said, it's not that big of a deal, but we just want to be mindful as we're putting colors next to each other, so that way they don't blend a whole bunch. I'm going back to my filbert brush because I'm going to do more of the smushy technique, but now I've picked up this really pretty teal color. And so this next layer is going to be the same color that I used in the camper. And this is where you're really going to start to see the smushy technique come alive, because as I smush the paint on the canvas, you're going to see a lot of the texture, and you're definitely going to see a lot of it when we start to use the darker blue. But I want that texture to come through, and I'm actually intentionally painting over the triangles that will be the tree, the pine trees. So I'm just taking my brush and I'm literally smushing it into the canvas. And I usually have a cheesy joke. I say, you know, a smushy technique is not a real art term, so don't try and, you know, impress your friends and family and talk about the smushy art technique when you're going to the art galleries, and everybody kind of laughs. But it's just the easiest way for me to describe how to apply the paint on the canvas. And we also want this to be very kind of organic. That's why we want these lines to be kind of loopy and up and down. They don't have to follow them exactly. I just wanted to kind of give them lanes of where to put the paint. Now, as I come close to this yellow, I'm going to overlap them by just smushing that brush a little bit. Now, if you remember, yellow and blue make green. So you might see a little bit of like kind of some green hues. That's okay, don't worry about it. In the whole scope of the painting, it'll actually look pretty cool. So just taking that light teal blue color. And once again, people can paint this in any colors that they love. If they love oranges or purples or pinks, reds and pinks, this can be customized a lot of fun ways. But once again, just a tiny, tiny bit of paint. And smushing that along there. And I always like to remind my painters, sometimes artists like to paint the sides of their canvas. Some don't have to, it's an optional step. But if they are, wherever that color touches the side of the canvas, wrap it around. One thing you'll also notice as I'm kind of doing the smushy technique, I'm rotating my arm and wrist. So I'm using all sides of the brush, all angles, but see how you can see all of that kind of marbly, smushy texture? That's what we're going for. So our next color is going to be the dark blue. I'm going to give my filbert brush a real quick rinse. And then just grab a little bit of that blue paint. And sometimes I'll even recommend that the artists, the painters, wipe off most of the paint on the side of the plate. So that way there's literally just a tiny, tiny bit. Now is when you're really going to start seeing that smushy technique and the texture of the canvas come through. And remember, your yellow and blue overlap a little bit. This dark blue and light blue will overlap a little bit. And when it comes to the night sky, we're actually going to do this in 2 layers. So this is just our base layer. So even when you're not done with this, it's going to look great, but it's going to look even better when we're done adding the second layer. So once again, just kind of giving myself different lanes for my paint. But you really want to avoid having very straight lines. So I want to make sure I'm using the edges of that brush to smush it around. Now, you can also use a wadded up paper towel to give neat texture. You can use saran wrap. Honestly, a lot of times I'll even, Use my fingers to kind of blend some edges. I might show you that with the black. But just kind of coming in here. And very thin layer of paint. I'm not using, you know, a big old glop. I always kind of joke with people. I'm like, if you've always heard your whole life that you lay it on thick, this is not the time to do that. We just want thin layers. And you can always go back and add more. But because I like to see the texture of the canvas through this layer of paint, I try and always tell people less is more. And every once in a while when you have long hair, you get a piece stuck in there. So that is our blue layer. Now, your natural thought might be, okay, we're going to start and do black up here. But I'm actually going to skip that portion for now and come down to our trees. So I'm going to get a small square brush. I like this for this step just because these are very tight angles. So I'm just going to come in here with a little bit of black paint. And I'm going to paint this entire bottom portion minus where the inside of the fire is. So I'm just going to come in here and start painting with a thin, even layer of black paint. Now you might remember in the beginning, I had recommended using a matte black paint. And the reason is I've found that with different brands of paint that sometimes the shiny finishes have a tendency to dry uneven. And what I mean by that is that the sheen isn't even. So that way you get shiny spots, spots that aren't as shiny, and it's very distracting. And I've only found that with a couple brands, but depending on what you use and what you have access to, maybe when you do your demo painting, see if you have any issues with that. And if not, you're fine. But if you have issues with that, if you get a matte black, just acrylic paint, you know, any of the brands have the matte or the satin. So always look for the matte if you're going to have issues with the finish not drying evenly. The sheen, I guess, is a way to say that. So I'm just doing a thin, even layer of black paint. And when we were painting our sky, we made sure to paint on top of that line so that way the black is nice and crisp. And once again, I'm using just like a 1/2-inch square brush. If you have an angle brush, that'll work perfectly fine too. Just anytime I have areas that I'm painting that are very angular or small, I have a tendency to like the square brush or the angle brush. And I'm going to show you, we're actually going to add texture to our trees so they don't just look like a bunch of skinny triangles. And the small square brush I found does really well for that technique as well. Now, I have taught a lot of paint parties, and some of them, the end result is awesome. And sometimes, you know, maybe it's my fault and I wasn't a good teacher of explaining a technique. So one of my biggest skill sets, I guess, or things that I try and always improve on is how I can explain things as an art teacher, as a paint party teacher. So if I'm the, you know, best artist of my generation, but I don't explain things well, I'm not a good teacher, teaching paint parties should not be the job for me. So I try really, really hard to make sure that I can explain things well, explain things clearly, so that way my painters understand what I'm trying to say, and then they can duplicate it. And all that to say, I have taught tons and tons and tons of pine trees, of evergreens, especially in the silhouette style. And they have a tendency to turn out either epically awesome or epically horrible. So I am actually doing this silhouette intentionally, because if I just had a bunch of lines here, or if I just let painters come in and paint the trees however they want, they're going to look odd. Not always, but a large majority of the time. I don't know what it is, but just people have a hard time doing the branches and the leaves. You know, Bob Ross makes it look so simple, but I have found it's not always that simple. So this is actually intentional for the end result look. Doesn't mean you have to teach it this way, but it's just the way that I would recommend it. And I'm just making sure my paint is nice and even so that way it dries evenly as well. I don't know how many times I'm painting and I have a big glob of paint and I don't realize it, and I touch it with my hand or touch it with, you know, my paintbrush and smear it everywhere. And once again, if you're painting the sides, wherever that black paint touches the edges, just wrap it around. This is totally optional. You know, I kind of tell people, you have to decide when you ship it off, you know, to the Louvre, if you want to frame it or not. And if you don't want to frame it, then just paint the edges of the canvas. You know, people laugh. So just making sure this is all evenly covered. And as it's drying, if you have any areas, black usually is pretty easy to cover an area equally. But if you find that you just don't have, you have areas that, you know, the canvas is still showing through, you can always come in and do a second layer. But for the most part, as long as painters take their time, they can come in here and shouldn't have too many issues. Now, I always caution people when it comes to black paint, because once you touch something with a little bit of black paint, it's really, really hard to cover up. You know, and if you accidentally touch black paint into any of your colors, it gets real muddy real quick. So just be cautious when it comes to using black paint. Doesn't mean that, you know, oopses can't be fixed, but just has a tendency to be a little bit harder to cover up a mistake with black paint than, let's say, like white or yellow. So just kind of outlining the smaller details, and then I like to go in and fill in the space between, but honestly, it doesn't matter how you do this as long as you get to the same step. But just gonna paint the background completely black. And once again, I recommend a matte black, but not a have to. And in these smaller little areas, I'm gonna fix my rock real quick. In the smaller areas, like around the fire, flame, and that kind of stuff, if you want to use a smaller detail brush, if that's more comfortable for you. And I'm also going to put a little bit of black on the kind of like tire wheel hubcap. A little bit of black inside. So sometimes even if you want to come in with a small brush and just do the outline, and then you can come back with the bigger brush and fill in the edges if you want to. I always tell people, do use whatever brush feels most comfortable in your hand. So if using a tiny brush feels more comfortable, you feel like you have more control, by all means, use a smaller brush. Just going to kind of go back over this and make sure it's a nice, even layer. Like I said, for whatever reason, sometimes different brands of black acrylic paint will dry uneven as far as the sheen of the paint. So just a nice matte black is recommended, but you don't have to use that if you don't want to. Okay, so as that is drying, now we're going to jump back into our night sky. Once again, my dark blue layer, it's still wet, but it's drier than it was 10 minutes ago, so that's fine. So using the same idea that we did down at the camper, I'm going to actually outline the moon first. And remember how I said I wasn't too worried about that black, the yellow paint, because this black paint's going to cover it up. And also, I will tell my painters that as they're painting, they are more than welcome to pick up their canvas and move it around. So as they're painting the sky, it's easier to paint it with it flipped around. Flip it around. So when it comes to doing that smushy technique again, I'm going to use my filbert brush. Come in with a little black paint. And I actually will paint this right up to where that blue starts. I'll leave a little bit of a margin, and then I will feather the black out into the blue, and I'll show you how to do that. Just because in the night sky we want this, where I don't mind if some of that white kind of shows through the paint. In the blackest part of the sky, we actually want this to be solid black. So I'll just go through. And like I said, I'm just leaving a little margin between the blue and the black. And I love this black because once you start adding the black, you start to get so much depth in the painting. And just making sure that this top layer is nice and even, and you get really good coverage. So I'm going to make sure, wipe most of that paint off of the brush, and then I'm going to do the same smushy technique. Now, I always start to where the black is. I just kind of push my brush down. And it might touch some of that blue, and if it's still wet, don't worry about it. Remember, we're going to do 2 layers over the night sky. But this is kind of how you get that hazy, gradual progression from the glow of the yellow into the light blue into the dark blue, and then finally into that night sky. Remember how I told you I'm moving my wrist in all directions. Just covering up that white little margin that I left. See? Starting to come together. I'm gonna paint the sides. Paint the top. Now, most of the time, if people are painting the edges, especially if they're painting this propped up on an easel, they'll paint the top and the 2 edges, but then they'll forget the bottom of the painting. They'll forget this edge, the bottom edge. And when you hang your painting on a wall, you're not going to see the top of it. And you may or may not see the sides, but you will definitely see the bottom. So if you have a painter and they're painting all the sides, I always kind of joke, I go, public service announcement, make sure that you get that bottom edge too, because if not, every time you walk past your painting, you're going to wish that you had painted it, and you're going to say my name with a curse word under your breath, and I don't want that. So that's my little joke. Because I don't know how many times people are finishing up their painting, paying their tab or whatever, if it's an in-person paint party, and then they go, oh, I forgot to paint the bottom side. And then they have to paint it real quick and, have a wet painting for a few minutes. So always try and give them a little public service announcement. So I am now going to come in and start adding the texture of the tree branches. Now, as you're painting this, remember I keep saying thin layers, make sure that layer's half dry. At any point, this actually might be a good time for you to take like a little break if any of your painters need to use a restroom or give their eyeballs a break. So if you're teaching this in person or online, you may want to tell people like, hey, now would be a good time to take a little 5 or 10 minute break. But I'm going to go ahead and just keep on painting. So now I'm going to use a small square brush. And that's probably, what size is it? It's a 1/2 inch. So it's a 1/2 inch square brush or 1/2 inch wash brush, or they also call them brights sometimes, or even an angled brush. Now, what I always tell people is, you know, depending on your generation, you may or may not get the references of a wall clock. But if you're thinking of like a wall clock, this is going to be probably like 4 o'clock and maybe like 7 o'clock. But I'm just going to come in and start doing real short little brush strokes at an angle. Sometimes people will have a tendency to want to do them side to side, but I recommend just coming in here with short little dashes, short little brush strokes. Like I said, probably like at a, I don't know, maybe like 5 and 7. Maybe those are good references. And, you know, people can come in and add more trees, less trees. They can change this up however they want. But I just wanted to give you guys a good basic, you know, outline. And they can make some of these little lines a little bit longer if they want to. Kind of flare them up a little bit. But we're just doing little tiny flicks of the wrist. Depending on if you're doing this virtually or in person, sometimes at my in-person paint parties, I will tell people, you know, if I supply plastic tablecloth, I'll even tell them, you know, my super fancy supplies, feel free to practice on the tablecloth if you need to. But like I said, some people will have a tendency to kind of do like this. And I don't know why people have a tendency to do that. Let me fix this. Make that tree a little bit bigger. But always angle them towards the bottom edges of the canvas. You can even tell them to kind of, you know, point their brush towards the edges. And some of these smaller little ones, you may not even have to give the edges texture because they're kind of the little tiny tree tops in the back. One other little technique trick is I'll tell people when they're doing something like this, take your brush and the paint and then wipe it back and forth a few times on each side. And what that does is it helps kind of keep all the bristles close together. And just so you have a crisper edge. And then come back and reload that brush. One other thing to maybe be mindful is the more pressure on the brush, the thicker the line. So you just want to do light pressure little flicks. I always tell people, I go, I know this sounds stupid, but it's the best way I can describe how to hold the brush, how much pressure. I tell people just tickle the brush or tickle the canvas with your brush, which like I said, I know sounds super, super nerdy, but just light pressure. I always think of the Queen and David Bowie song, Under Pressure. But you don't want to hear me sing. I'll spare you. So just short little flicks of the wrist. I heard somebody one time describe it as that you're like swiping your credit card through the you know, ATM or the debit machine. Just a little credit card swipe action. But once again, talking about being a good teacher, I always try and find ways to describe things that people can understand. Most people will understand what it means to swipe a credit card, you know, so that's the same little wrist motion. So as you're teaching people, the more you teach people, the more that, you know, you encounter people that have different artistic levels, that you just find different ways to describe either how to mix or how to apply. Like I said, the smushy technique, I taught that and said that and repeated myself dozens, if not, you know, tens of dozens of times. But that's the best way for me to describe getting all that texture in the night sky. So once again, just kind of jumping around. Before I come back and do anything down here with my camper or my bonfire, I need to make sure those are nice and dry. So I'm actually going to start to apply some of the stars in the night sky. We're going to come, oh, you know what, I lied. We're going to let this dry. I'm actually going to zap it with a blow dryer, but you want to make sure that you're painting, your trees are nice and dry, because we're going to come in and start adding the second layer of color. So I'm going to blow dry my canvas for a little bit, and then we can move on. You know, and as your painters are letting certain layers dry, you can always come back in and add a second layer of paint to your camper. Now, as I'm doing this tutorial, I'm just talking to you guys. If I was doing this in a paint party, I would be walking around, I would be talking to people, helping people. So what takes me 10 minutes to do on one canvas, you know, your painters are going to have more time in between instruction and drying time and, you know, whatever else. So you probably won't have to have them take a little drying break. But just be mindful, because you do want to make sure any black paint is completely dry before you start to paint near it or on top of it. Now, when it comes to doing like a gray, say that's too dark. Sometimes it's hard to help people mix a gray again that matches, like how you saw my first attempt did not. So sometimes it's helpful to have a pre-mixed or a pre-purchased gray. So if you want just to kind of give your painters an extra little boost of confidence, you may want to supply them with a consistent gray. So if you have, you know, gray in your paint supplies, or if you're going to teach this virtually and give them a supply list, you may want to suggest buying a gray. Since my tire is black in real life, I'm actually going to make this a darker gray than the trailer, just so it kind of looks a little more like a tire than the light gray of the camper. So not a have to, but just a little layer like that. So this step is optional, but if you want to go back and add a second layer of color into the night sky. Once again, just make sure any tree tops are completely dry, because if I come in here with wet paint and accidentally touch wet yellow paint, it will mix. So see how some of that looks a little bit green? It's okay. Main thing is we just don't want solid bands of color. We want one color to kind of blend into the other. So I'm just kind of tapping some yellow paint in this area where the yellow and the light blue overlap. Just a tiny, tiny bit. You don't have to paint the entire area over again. Then I'm going to do the same thing with some of this light blue. Kind of overlap that over the dark blue. And if you paint over any of the trees, you can always go back and paint them. Actually, you know what I'd probably recommend doing is doing the trees, the edges after we did the second layer on the sky. So just a little bit of this blue, once again, just kind of smushing it, scraping it a little bit on there. Just if they want a little softer transition from one color to the next. You'll still see that darker layer. So here you still see the light blue. This one you'll still see the dark blue. Just a little bit. But it adds to that cosmic fluffiness. And then once again, do the same step with a little bit of that blue. Thin layers, thin transparent see-through layers. Just a little tiny paint, most of it wiped off, and then come in here and smush it around. We want very bellowy, kind of organic shakes. Let's see how this one's like really like a roller coaster. That's what we want. See how pretty that sky looks? I'm digging it. And then when it comes to doing stars, I always have the same cheesy joke. I always tell people, okay, I have a little secret, but don't tell anybody. I actually like to use the wooden handle of my paintbrush as a stamp. So anytime you're doing polka dots, you're doing stars, I'm just going to come in here, and I usually get about 2 or 3 good stamps, and then I have to go back and dip it into paint. Sometimes people will try and do like 15 at a time, and as they get past about 3 or 4, they start to run out of paint, and it just doesn't look all that neat and crisp. So I'm just using pure white. I'm going to come in here and add the stars kind of in clusters. Sometimes I'll cluster like 3 or 2 together. Sometimes people want to have a tendency to do them, you know, the exact same distance apart, you know, almost like polka dots or like a grid. But I tell people, have some close together, have some far apart, do the little clusters of maybe 3. But I'm going to put the most and the most condensed layer in the black part of the sky. And I like to kind of, I don't know, frame. So I might even actually put a thicker concentration around the corners. That's just my preference. But like I said, maybe encourage your painters to do clusters of 3s or do 2 close together. But you can bring these stars all the way down, even into the like light blue and dark blue. But I would have the most of them concentrated in that black part of the sky. If you were out camping, that would be where you would see the clearest stars anyways. But people can add as few or as many. Sometimes it's kind of fun for them to look up constellations and, you know, paint different constellations, but they can just go hog wild. And once again, it kind of is helpful because as other parts are drying, you can go in and do the stars. Now I'm going to come into the moon, and we have that first layer of yellow. And I like to go in and just brighten it up again if need be. And if you like the sliver of the moon like it is, leave it. But I like to come in here, and it's the same smushy technique. I come in here with some yellow and start right at the inner edge and just slowly smush some of that yellow over where the black is. Just using my little brush and kind of tapping. So it kind of adds to the craters on the moon, but just on the inside edge. And as you get to the thinner edges, have it really thick and consolidated in the middle, and then just kind of tapered off. And if somebody does this and they hate it, come in with some black paint and cover it up. Who cares? At the end of the day, it's just paint. It's a kind of fun little moon. I mean, this would look super cute with just that crescent moon outline, but you want to give it a little more pizzazz. Just kind of add some of that texture towards the middle. And that kind of just adds a little bit of the same, you know, color and effect. I mean, shoot, if you want to, you can even come in and throw in a few yellow stars. You can even add gold or silver. That might be kind of fun. I've taught this style of painting, these kind of cosmos skies, quite a few times. And one thing that's also fun that I've seen people do is once they take these home, they'll get little twinkly lights and put it behind the canvas. So that even adds more to the star effect. So just a couple little dots for if you want yellow stars, that's optional. Now I still have yellow on my brush. I'm going to come in here and paint the fire. I want to make sure all around is nice and dry where that black is. I'm going to paint over the red, so it's actually going to kind of be more of an orangey color. And I'm going to paint just outside that black outline. So the cool thing about doing this is your fire will look like it's glowing. Because where the white is, it'll be the brightest yellow. Where the red is, it'll kind of pick up an orangey color. And because you're painting just outside the black outline, it'll kind of look like it's glowing. And just like that. And you can go back and add white or any other colors that you want. But that is our campfire. Now I'm going to come in and outline my camper. You can do this with a detail brush. Heck, you can even do this with a Sharpie if you wanted to. Once again, how I always say, use whatever brush feels the most comfortable in your hand. For some of these straight lines, I'm going to use a little skinny side of my square brush. And if you need to go and clean up, you know, even the outside line, that's why I wasn't too worried about it when I was filling in the color. You know, these campers are so aerodynamic. This step is just as easy to do with a Sharpie marker as it is to do with a paintbrush. So if your painters or you are just more comfortable with a little Sharpie or a little tiny detail brush, use whatever is most comfortable for you. I love black because you can just go in and clean up all those lines. You know, people always go, "You're such a good artist." And I'm like, well, I know lots of tricks. And that's one of them. One other little trick, if you are using a detail brush, what I will do often is twirl the brush in the paint. And once again, that will just kind of help keep all of those bristles nice and together. Just outline that little window. And then this little window. And then I'm going to go and outline the bottom of my camper. And I'm going to outline the boulders down here. Little rocks around the fire pit. So as that dries, I'm going to come in and do a second layer on my trees. What I would probably recommend doing is not doing the edges of the trees until this point. So you're not having to do this step twice. So I'd recommend holding off to doing the texture on the side of the trees until you've finished with the layers of the sky. But if you made an oops like I did and painted over them, like I said, black is so forgiving in this aspect because you can just go in there with some fresh black paint and never ever know. Unless you're telling me. Don't tell me, okay? And this painting can be customized so many different ways. Instead of the camper, you could do, you know, a little tent. You could do, you know, just the fire pit if you wanted to. Just short little swipes with my brush. Little credit card swipes. All right, guys, we are in the home stretch. I'm going to go ahead and have us do the little steam from the bonfire pit. So we have our little flame. You can leave it as is, but if you want a little trail of smoke, just how we did the stars, I take my brush and I just dab a little bit of white, kind of in a trail up into the sky. Now, you can use a brush for this. If you use a brush, use a nice, clean, dry brush. I also honestly will use my finger, and I'm just going to come in here and kind of tap my finger, and drag that paint just like that. I think I accidentally did some of my stars. Whoopsie, that's okay though. But just that little trail of smoke, and less is more. You can always go back and add extra. And then what I like to do is go in and add a few dots of white, yellow, and red, just so it looks like maybe the fire was popping and some of the little embers are coming through. But the exact same way that we did our stars, you can add maybe one or two little dots of yellow, and then I'll come in here and maybe just add like one or two red ones down by the fire. But now you have your little fire smoking fire pit. I'm going to add some more yellow ones up here. I kind of keep the dots in the white stream so that way, like I said, it all kind of looks like it's just that little trail of smoke. Okay guys, I'm going to show you how to add a little extra dimension down kind of where the camper and the trees are. So I'm just going to take my small square brush and I'm going to take some yellow paint. If you want, you can make a little bit of like a light orange, maybe mix a little bit of red, but I'm just going to use yellow here. And underneath my camper, I'm going to paint a line that goes side to side, horizontal, and then I'm just going to pull that color down. Do the same thing under the bonfire. Just makes it look like there's a little light glowing and the ground's there. And then you can take your brush, and before we were holding it side to side, now we're going to hold it up and down. We're going to come in and paint a line. You can either do a solid line, or I sometimes call this like a broken line. And all this is this is just a little bit of the reflection from the bonfire onto these trees in the background. Just a little suggestion of like that light. Just barely touching the tree trunks. And if you want, you can even put like a little extra one. But I kind of have all the lines end roughly at the same point. Just because that way it kind of makes the eye think, the brain think that that's where the ground is and that's where the trees would end. Just that extra little detail. The trees closest to the fire, you can make those lines a little bit thicker because those tree trunks would have more of the light reflecting, but it's just just an extra little detail. But that is this cute little painting. So I hope you guys had a ton of fun watching me, and I can't wait to see what you guys paint. All right, guys, I hope you had a ton of fun painting under the stars. I know I had a ton of fun designing it and teaching it to you. And once you've painted this, make sure you tag me so I can see what you've created. I'm so excited. Now, I've also put together a fun free gift. This is a journal cover that will cover a standard composition book, and it's actually made out of a canvas painting. So if you want to learn how to make a journal cover out of a painted canvas, make sure to look for the information in the description.